Now you're welcome along to the Huddle preview. We're looking ahead to the Scottish Cup fourth round, and it is a big one. Celtic against Rangers, 3 o'clock this Sunday. Alan Morrison and Jaco James are on the line with me now. Lads, how are you getting on?
Good, thanks.
Happy Friday.
Yeah,
Happy
definitely.
Friday indeed. Hopefully it'll be a happy Saturday and Sunday for Celtic fans as they take on Rangers this Saturday at 3 o'clock in the Scottish Cup fourth round. Obviously, we know Rangers well at this point in time. We've played them 3 times this season already, and we're going to play them another couple of times before the end of the season. So I suppose Scottish Cup, it's a little bit different to the league games, especially now that the league is over. It's something to play for. There's a trophy on the line. That probably adds a little bit more pressure to it for the likes of John Kennedy and these players, but also it should be a bit of motivation as well, Alan.
Yeah, and I think pressure is a good thing. And the reason I say that is because, Celtic are playing a team that, as far as I'm concerned, has been put under no pressure at all at any point during this season. And I think it will be really good to see how they deal with that pressure. And I don't think there's any. I think there's pressure on Celtic because clearly there's a bit of redemption there in terms of what an appalling season that Celtic have had, and obviously as holders of the Scottish Cup, it's theirs to lose. Having this incredible run in the competition. But what I'm looking for Celtic to do is to put them under pressure and see how they deal with it, because, as I say, it's something that hasn't happened domestically at any point at all in this season.
Like Jack Charlton put him under pressure from the Italian 90s for any elder Ireland fans listening to the podcast. One thing that's coming up time and time again, especially on our Twitter, when we asked if there was any questions ahead of this game, and that is Sockboy, who is asking what's the best formation to play against these 4-2-3-1 or the diamond, and Eddie is also asking what's the best way to cope with their system as well, especially down to our heights. So James, I suppose you do a lot of benchmarking going into these games. You've mentioned the narrow formation that Rangers play. So in terms of Celtic, let's start with us. What formation should we be playing in this game?
I won't presuppose to know. I think I certainly have an opinion. I think most importantly, I think there's a decent chance that we'll play a coherent formation, which is a great step forward, as we talked about yesterday on our review of the Livingston game. So a lot of positives to take away from the stretch under Kennedy. I have a strong preference for the diamond, and that there's multiple aspects to that. First is, to my surprise, quite frankly, preceding the January 2nd derby, I did some testing because it looked like we might be playing the diamond heading into that. And I went through a bunch of teams that play a similar 4-3-3 to Rangers, i.e. Liverpool and some other teams. I mean, they all have obviously little intricacies and variations. And I've talked about this on prior shows, but I was surprised by the lack of that matchup. And I think it somewhat has to do with kind of the common sense expectation that with the importance of the fullbacks in the system that Rangers play, that playing kind of a diamond midfield might open up the flanks too much, and it intuitively might be a bad matchup. Or a bad system to use. So when I tested, I was actually shocked at how effective it had been, just broadly. And so that gave me some optimism heading into January 2nd. And I think that optimism was largely, validated because we pretty much dominated that game up until the red card, to varying degrees. I mean, we've had this issue of running out of gas in the second half, the whole season pretty much. So obviously small sample, one game. But given the context of the other research I did and looking at kind of benchmarking other teams and the matchups. So that's just a general preference. And then if you look at our available personnel, I think, I think there's been this interesting renewal of a romance with Forrest. And as I've talked about, I'm a big fan of Forrest, but his track record against Rangers generally has not been great, even just from a statistical perspective, a performance statistical perspective. So I don't see him as being a savior playing 4-2-3-1. I don't like Brown in the 4-2-3-1, which I've said over and over again, and the issues that presents relative to transitions. We saw that against Livingston again, where Livingston really aren't good enough to make Celtic pay. But multiple occasions Brown was kind of caught forward pressing or making runs with the ball deep into Livy's the final third in attacking and just leaving huge holes and space in the midfield. So with the diamond, we don't have that kind of vulnerability nearly as much. So as it looks like Brown's probably going to get selected, I'd much rather have him play as kind of a central six, kind of that discipline role that Alan and I have talked about. If with the fitness issues and the questions about Forrest, I mean, this is the current version of Forrest, which again, he had a decent game against Falkirk and a decent game against Livingston, but that is not a European level opponent. So the idea that he, with the limited amount of time that he's had, even if we ignore kind of the long-term track record and the issues that we've had relative to Rangers with him playing, that's a step up. That's a big step up. And I think to Alan's point, I expect this game to be quite different than either of the last two because of the pressure, because it being, there's no replays. So this is it. So I suspect it might be a little cagey, and then maybe, they really go after each other a little bit, which might hopefully be entertaining. So again, I like the sound structure of the diamond. I'll be controversial, and I'd prefer Christie in that midfield with the energy in that context, relative to, again, Forrest, where he's maybe re-injured and also having not played at this level in quite some time. So that's my preference.
Well, the thing about Forrest is that, he's only back from fitness. So is he fully match fit in the first place? And then if he's injured again or even half injured, then I don't really see the positive side of starting him in this game. You can have him on the bench if you want, but I mean, if he's not fully fit to begin with and he's got injured again, then he's definitely not up to match fitness to play against the likes of Rangers. And I think if he plays or not, really largely will dominate the Celtic formation, because if he plays, it's likely to be a 4-2-3-1 with him on the right rather than him on the right of a diamond. So I think that would make sense. If he's not ready, then Celtic are probably going to play the diamond, I would imagine. In terms of this game, though, Alan, and it's been mentioned, the draw last time out, the game didn't really mean anything, but both teams are going for a win here now. So we might see a different Celtic side, but we also might see a different Rangers side as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to tuppence on the formation side, I guess formations are interesting. I like discussing them as much as anyone, but really, to me, shape is more important than formation. So it's really where you are and what your role is on the pitch. With the ball, it can be quite different from without the ball as well. So you often have two different shapes. Celtic often, even in a 4-2-3-1 nominally, we're actually 4-4-2 out of possession under Lennon. So shape's more important and organisation, really, to me. But I agree with what you said. I think if Forrest is fit, then I think he plays, and it is pretty much what we saw last week. Possibly Laxalt coming in for Taylor, just because he's got that more energy. And I think a well managed, disciplined Laxalt is possibly could got the edge on Taylor in that regard. So same as Brown. I'm less worried about Brown than I have been, only because he's clearly been told to limit his role to staying fairly centrally and not being too expansive in his kind of horizontal movement. So he's playing a much simpler role. That makes absolute sense. Even if Celtic play the 4-2-3-1, what I would expect is that, especially possibly out of possession, it becomes actually a mirror of Rangers 4-3-3 in any case. Turnbull dropping in, the two players who will often come in attacking shape in any case. Elunisi and Forrest, as we saw against Livingston, they were making inside channel runs over and over again, and that was very effective. And Turnbull, it's no great stretch for Turnbull to drop back as an 8. So I could see Kennedy perhaps matching up. Otherwise, if Forrest is not fit, then it's a simpler decision to bring Christie in and go back to that sort of diamond shape, which I think suits that group of players quite well. But I agree with what you're saying. We're going to see a different game. I mean, again, one of the many things you won't read in the Scottish press is that I felt personally that in the last 2 games they played quite defensively and had a very defensive mindset. They were going to be happy with a draw in both games. At New Year, it was, can Celtic catch up? And then in the last game, they're just at this stage they're protecting their unbeaten record. And really, the win fell into their laps after that sending off in the January game, and then they managed to get a quick goal after we did score from another set piece. But to be honest, they had been taking a long time over throw-ins, restarts from almost the first minute. It will be very different, I think, as you rightly say, on Sunday. Because somebody has to win, they have to come out a bit more, and I think it will suit Celtic, because what you saw was Barisic relatively wasn't really coming much beyond the halfway line in either of those games, and not playing as expansively. And this is a team that has only conceded 11 goals in the league, and we'll come on to expected goals, I'm sure, later. But they are essentially quite a defensive team, and I think that's their nature. But so they're going to have to open up at some point, and I think that with Celtic, I've got superior speed in the team, so I think there's opportunities there when they do.
Yeah, and I think we saw the intent from Celtic, maybe not the execution to a large extent, when we played them in the drawn game, where El Younousi was getting on the left back or the right back of Rangers, getting off the left side of the midfield, and really that was where we were targeting. In terms of this game then, you mentioned XG there, we may as well talk about the XG. Rangers are a side that are outperforming their XG at the minute, but I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But in terms of, will we start with Celtic or will we start with Rangers when it comes to the XG and what we're performing, where we're benchmarking at the minute?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll let James pick that up, but I'll just rattle through comparative stats aggregated over 3 games, because this might surprise you. This is the 3 games between the two. These are some kind of these are metrics I tend to look at as my sort of summary stats for a match. So expected goals, this is aggregated over 3 games, 3.47 to 3.26 in Celtic's favour. Shots total 32 to 25. Chances created 26 to 20. Passing impact, so this is the ability to play through lines. Total score 9-3-5 Celtic, 6-9-2 for them. Goalkeeper saves 5 by Celtic keepers, 9 by McGregor. So you look at that, and it's pretty level, if not Celtic having the edge actually. So I think we should take some comfort from that.
James, do you take comfort with that?
Yes and no. I did a thread earlier in the week. So I joked yesterday when we started the show about Kennedy's comments, and he referenced it in his pregame presser today. It was pretty clear what he was saying in context, and I did a thread earlier in the week looking at kind of XG trends this season, variance, and some of the just pretty remarkable fortune. And again, I'm not diluting or making light of the accomplishments this season in the league of Rangers, but you don't go undefeated in a league season without some degree of variance that's positive. So I referenced in that thread how Rogers' invincible side had, I think it was a +8 in penalty calls. Last season, Lennon's Celtic, which actually from an XG perspective, an XG differential perspective, was a little better than Rogers' invincible side. They had a +5 in red cards. So the opponents had, I think, 6 red cards, and Celtic only had 1 last season. This season, Rangers have had 9 penalties, none against. They've made 6. So that's 6 goal difference. And they've had 0 red cards, and their opponents have had 5. So they've basically had the fortune of Rogers' side and Lennon's side combined in one season, and from December, mid-December, when their performance levels really started to decline. We talk about something called expected points, which is just based off of probability relative to shot creation in each game. You can do, Monte Carlo simulation of that and create something called expected points. So again, it's a probability thing. It's like all of these things. It's all about analyzing probabilities and sequencing and that kind of thing. And if you do that for their whole season, really, they've outperformed on an relative to their expected points by about 11, I think 11 or 12, and almost all of that since December. So they've had pretty good sequencing here since mid-December, where they've had a run of games that were very close on an XG basis, where they easily could have dropped points. They drew against Hamilton, despite Hamilton, I think it was over 1 in XG differential. The game against Hibs this past weekend was kind of a, from an XG perspective, was a toss-up, and there was the header where there was the foul call, so that very easily could have been a draw if the call goes the other way. You had the
call. Is that a euphemism?
Well,
it's an absolute disgrace. I mean,
it was a bad call.
Why do we bother looking at stats when you get decisions like that?
Yeah. So, and then there was the red card from Roof early in the game. It should have been a red card, and I think subsequently went back and gave him the red card. So again, that kind of stuff. And I prefer not to get down into the supposition on some of the stuff, but regardless of why or how, the reality is they've had good fortune, right? It's just almost an argument. And it's not like Celtic haven't had it in the past. Like I just said, with the two really good performing Celtic sides of the last 5 or 6 seasons. So, whether it's talent disparity, whether it's, refereeing quality, whatever it might be, the reality is the sequencing and the variance has been very favorable to Rangers. Well, why does that matter? Well, I don't think they're as good as their table record suggests. Just like I argued they were a lot better last season. So this is not me winding up Rangers. I made a rather lengthy argument that they were much better than the table of 13 points suggested at the conclusion of last season. Well, I think this season the teams are way closer than 20 points in relative quality. So within that context, I think Kennedy's comments about a one-off game are completely accurate. Not only from just a generic sense, any two teams in a one game, it's always going to be from a probabilities perspective, variance is always much higher in single games, as we've talked about over and over again, and probably will never cease talking about. Yeah. But when you start getting down into relative quality of teams, I think, and this is why I argued that Kennedy should have been appointed, a lot earlier than he was as caretaker, is just a competently managed Celtic side, even with, the poor transfer window and the incoherence of the transfer window, I think is a close in quality team relative to Rangers. Now, is that a 5% difference one way or the other? Over a season, that kind of discussion matters. In a one-off game, it's, whether it's 5%, 10% in quality, either direction, it's really academic to a degree.
Yeah. All you need to do is look at teams that did well in the Champions League comparative to their league form. For example, the year Chelsea won it, when Di Matteo eventually took the side to a Champions League trophy, or Liverpool in 2005 in Istanbul. Their league form was awful, but they're once-off Champions League games. And maybe that's also an argument that can be thrown at Pep Guardiola's teams these days, is that over the course of a long-term season, yes, he does really well, but in these cup games, there is an argument to be made that the likes of Jose Mourinho or their style of football or their style of management works better, because it's a different ball game altogether to the league form. In terms of this game, sorry, go ahead on.
Sorry, Enda. I was going to say Guardiola is interesting because his whole philosophy and style of play that he has his teams playing is to reduce variance as much as he possibly can. I don't think he would call it that, and he would probably see it as something far more romantic. But actually, what he's actually doing, if you look at his methods, is he's trying to reduce variance by maintaining possession, by trying to get overloads in key positions, and by trying to get the ball into situations where you're going to have a higher XG than if you shot from further out. Making that sound overly simple. He trains in complex patterns and movement for his players to achieve that. But fundamentally, that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it is simple though. Like, you know what I mean?
It's a concept, yes.
Yeah, it's a concept. Because I often think with football analysis, people get too bogged down a little bit on, like people talk about the modern day footballer and how they understand the game a lot more and all this here. But realistically, like, the objective is still the same. You overload in certain positions, you keep the ball, you move into space, and it's essentially all about understanding space. And if you read Pep Guardiola's book, like the majority of it is just understanding the space that you're in. So that's he's an interesting case study in terms of his philosophy.
And actually, kudos to the Rangers, because another stat, sorry, I meant to give you, is actually, despite all of those comparative aggregate numbers that I gave you, the one I should have given you, and I genuinely just forgot in as I was scrolling through, was the touches in the box actually is 39 Celtic, 50 to them, and that's exactly the point. And if you watch the way they play, and I've said this before, they in contrast to Celtic under Lennon, who would, as soon as there was some space to cross, they would be lumping the ball into the box. They come out, they could start again. Unless there's a really good quality and a high chance of finding somebody in the box, they tend to recycle the ball. Because again, the way that they're trained is to try and maximize on those chances. And that showed in that very one stat, the fact that despite being behind on all of those metrics, they actually have worked the ball into the box on more occasions because of that patience, because of that. And it's a very deliberate approach to the way that they play.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of this fixture, then, as we move on to the actual prediction of it, like, these games have been very close, and often Celtic have, dominated 15-20 minutes off them. So I think looking at a Celtic side, they're a bit more confident than they were over the last two fixtures against the Rangers, and looking a bit more, organized, understanding what their roles are. El Younousi has an actual role in the team now that involves very specific things to do. So are we more confident going into this game now than the previous games? I think we would be, wouldn't we?
Well, as always, I'll be a jerk and be nuanced.
I want a yes or no. Come on, black and white. Come on.
I am more optimistic on the result. I'm less relative to January 2nd. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Relative to January 2nd, because again, I think the last game was,
yeah, it was a nothing game.
Yeah, it was nothing. So the game, there's only really been one game this season where there's been something of degree at stake, because the first game was COVID ridden, and I mean, it was just a complete debacle and mess. So that January 2nd game, I was quite confident going into it, and then Celtic just suffered horrible variance in that game. I mean, it was just a bad luck kind of game, with a lot of bad decisions that we reviewed at the time, where the opportunities of open space Celtic created in that game were just incredible. And the amount of XG that we created off of the opportunities were pathetic. So I'm optimistic that we might finally get a little bit of positive variance. I mean, we're certainly due. But I'd actually be surprised if the underlying performance is as good as January 2nd. Okay. So I think, and part of that's my green and white tinted glasses, let's say, that, probably somewhere close, kind of a, not much in it in the differential on an XG basis, or even, Rangers could, outperform. But I think having a coherent setup with Edouard and El Younousi, particularly El Younousi, with I think that's something that people have started to come around about most recently again, is how good of a finisher he is.
If he keeps finishing like Dalglish, then I'm going to have to insist we buy him.
Yeah, mean, that's been evident in his whole tenure too, Al. I mean, it's evident in his Basel data and his, Mulda. I mean, he is a good finisher. So so's Turnbull. We've talked about that, right? So we could have a couple of Turnbull 30-yarders that go in, that kind of thing, or an El Yunusi incredible finish. Or a flying header, that kind of thing. So I think we've got the quality now and the coherence now where we're set up to have some positive variance potentially with some finishers. So that's my nuanced view. Probably a little worse on a performance basis relative, but that we might finish our chances better. Mm-hmm. At least that's my hope.
Alan, I'll give you the first dibs at the prediction then.
So listen, I choose positive. Okay, today I choose to be positive. I don't know whether it's because it's sunny here. I've got a really busy weekend. I've had my haircut. I'm so happy about that. Finally, so I choose to be positive.
You've got a wonderful shirt on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Friday shirt time. So, listen, I think the more I looked at this game, the more the sort of positive variance that they've had, and we can go into the reasons for that. Is it by design or are there other factors? I think there's probably a combination. They've had a lot of close games recently where they've had the benefit of the variance, sometimes referee induced, sometimes it's just the way it's gone, over and over and over again. If you look at their individual players in the league, Aribo, Arfield, Hadji, Morelos, Roof, they're all overperforming on expected goals and assists versus what they're actually achieving. Whereas on the Celtic side, Christie, Rogic, Edouard are all underperforming on that basis. Turnbull's kind of average, and so is McGregor's kind of as expected, and El Yunis is probably the only one that's really overperforming a little bit. But again, you look at he's only played the equivalent of about 11 games in the league. Whereas you look at them, you've got Barisic 31 league appearances, Goldson 34, Kamara 29, Aribo 27, Hadji 29, Morelos 26, Kent 34, Davis 31. They've had virtually no injuries to speak of. Jack's been missing for a while, and Arfield's been missing for a while, but I wouldn't call them game-changing players. They've really had, and on top of the positive variance, both goals for and goals against, on top of all the refereeing decisions that have gone their way, they've had virtually no injuries. They've been able to select a very settled team. They've not made many changes in the league. The Rangers have got one of the lowest averages for a number of changes to lineup per league game. We talked about Livingston last week by design having a lot more changes per lineup. So all of those things point to me that. Yeah, as well as the context of the three games that we have had, the absolute catastrophe of an international window that preceded game one, on top of all of the existing injuries. Morelos not picking up a yellow card until his sixth foul. And then the game two where Morelos commits a straight red card offence in the 4th minute and doesn't even get booked, and then the referee and then Bitton. Madden nearly dislocated his shoulder getting the red card out for him, which was fair enough. I think it was a red card, etc. But as James said, the negative variance for Celtic in these games is just gone on and on and on. So I choose positive, but I'm also just really enthused about how Celtic have settled under Kennedy. And most of the metrics are trending positive in those last games. But what I saw against Livingston, and I know it's 6-0, it's Livingston, you might say, but what I saw was improved movement, improved fitness, improved coherence, and improved variation of play. I saw players simplifying their game. I've seen Laxalt simplifying his game. Kenny is becoming more effective because he's simplified his game. Brown has simplified his game. El Yunusi's hitting form. The only one that really worries me is actually Edouard, because I do think his head is just nowhere near it at the moment, as we talked about on the huddle breakdown yesterday. So I choose positive. I think they're definitely due one. I mean, even in Europe, I think they've done really well. I think they're very well coached by Beale, a very well organised, coherently recruited, set up team of I'm not. I honestly don't mean to damn by faint praise when I say average players, because if you look at it, there's not one of the reasons they didn't have many issues with international periods because they don't actually have that many international players in the squad. But they've been coached into a really good unit. They've done really well in Europe, but they haven't played a single team from the top 5 leagues apart from Leverkusen, who beat them very, very comfortably. So be positive is my message. We're due some positive variance. The team is on the right trajectory in the way that we're playing. Their players have played a lot of games this season. They've been sneaking games right, left, and centre in the last sort of month or so, and that variance has to go against them at some point. It just has to.
Mm-hmm. You very, very like train spotting there with the choose positive. So I think I'm confident going into this game. I think this is the first real test that Rangers have faced in terms of Celtic this year, because as you said, the reasons behind there, the COVID, the January, this is the first time that Celtic have had someone in charge who has the team organized and the players are fit and they're confident and they're playing well. So this is the real first derby match of the year that actually means something, and actually Rangers might get a proper test in it. So I'm confident Celtic might actually win this, if not at least bring it to extra time. So, James, what's your score prediction?
Yeah, so if we play the diamond, I'll go 3-1 Celtic.
Okay.
If we line up 4-2, 3-1, I'll say penalty kicks after a 1-1 draw.
Alan, your thoughts?
I'm going to go 2-1 Celtic. I think Bobby Madden will nick one, but I think we'll. Do you know? Actually, when I was listing all the appearances, I think Bobby Madden's had enough appearances to get a league medal this year. So, congratulations!
Fair play to him. I'm going to go even further. I don't think Celtic are going to concede in this. I'm going to say 2-0 to Celtic, and I'd say I'm going to be the probably furthest off in terms of my prediction, but I don't care. Anyway, that is the Huddle preview for the weekend. Enjoy the derby match. Hopefully we come out with a win, and hopefully next week's breakdown will be a positive one, because we have not had a positive one after a derby so far yet. So let's hope for that, and you can catch that in the usual places as well. Thanks for listening. We'll chat to you later.